The M1 carbine is the weapon that helped to win World War II. It was accurate, it had good penetration, and it was lightweight. Unlike previous models that were difficult to carry, a soldier could be outfitted with an M1 carbine and carry the ammunition to sustain it. But best of all, it was cheap. You could make it about half the cost of any of the other rifles that were used in World War II. MacArthur said it was one of the strongest contributing factors to the victory in the Pacific. And we would not have had it not been for a prisoner with a gun. You see, the story goes back to July of 1921 when sheriff's deputies raided a moonshine still. In the confusion of the rain, shots rang out and a deputy was shot. Though he swore he never fired a shot, David Marshall Williams was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now, Williams was a mechanical genius. He had built his first gun when he was 10 years old, and even in prison, he had ideas about guns. In fact, he began secretly working on a gun that would have a short stroke piston that would use a firing bullet to help load the next one into the chamber. He was working on that while in prison, but working on a gun isn't something that most prisoners are allowed to do. But the warden saw something in Williams, and he allowed him to work on that gun. Of course, when word got out about him letting a prisoner with access to firearms, he was called to the carpet. The warden did something rather unusual. He said if Williams used a gun in any escape attempt, he himself would serve out his remaining sentence. 8 years later, Williams was pardoned, and he began work on the M1 carbine with a group of other individuals. That rifle would eventually have 6 million of them produced, and as we said earlier, helped save the war. Only because somebody trusted a prisoner. Usually that isn't what we think someone to ever do. A prisoner who's in jail for drug dealing and the killing of a cop, well, that would be someone who we would think would have no redeeming qualities. Someone who we might be tempted to throw away and lock them up and throw them away with the key. But we need to be careful with that attitude. Specifically when the Bible commands us to remember the prisoners. In Hebrews 13:3, we're told, remember the prisoners, as though in prison with them, those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves are also in the body. Here the Hebrew writer reminds those Christians to remember those that are in prison. Don't forget about those who have been sent away. You think about being forgotten in prison, your mind thinks about Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph? Young man sold by his brothers into slavery. Eventually he is bought by a man named Potiphar. Potiphar's wife lusts after Joseph. And when he refuses to do anything with her, she makes accusations that have him thrown in prison. And while he's there, he is with a couple of people who were once in Pharaoh's court. And one of those men in a dream finds an escape, finds that he'll actually be restored to his position. And Daniel helps him out and tells him what his dream is. When it goes well with you, please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. Even here I have done nothing that they should put me in this dungeon. He was forgotten. In fact, Genesis chapter 40, verse 23 tells us the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. It's easy to forget about a prisoner. It's easy because we may think, well, they did something to deserve their fate. They obviously did something wrong or they wouldn't be in that state. Well, as we mentioned earlier, that's not always the case. When the Hebrew writer was writing to those Christians about remember those in prison, they would have understood that principle. In Hebrews 10:32 and 34, he says, remember the former days when being enlightened you endured great conflict and suffering, partly being made a public spectacle through the reproaches and tribulation. to the prisoners and joyfully accepted the seizure of your property, knowing that you yourselves have a better possession and a lasting one. Here he reminds them that they were to be remembering prisoners as they had. They had showed sympathy to those because they knew it could have been them. You see, many of those people they were talking about were people who were in prison for doing nothing more than sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Many had become under attack because of their connections to Christians and the Christian faith. But even so, everyone that is in prison may not be as guilty as they're made to be. You know, prison is a place that sometimes people end up because of their own consequences, and sometimes they end up there maybe because of some bad circumstances that are not their own. You know, the Bible speaks about the people who were in the hall of faith of Hebrews 11, and how some of them were prisoners. Hebrews 11:36 says, others experienced mocking and scourging, yes, even chains and imprisonment. Paul himself would have known that, for he spent quite a bit of time as a prisoner. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 20, he says, I am an ambassador in chains, that I proclaim that I may speak it boldly. His imprisonment made it difficult. It would have been much easier for him to keep his head down and say nothing, but yet he decided. Someone who had done the things that he had done, just the fact that he was in prison, even though they would know the reason he was there, caused many to turn from him. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15 and 16, it says, you are aware of the fact that those in Asia turned from me, among whom were Phileus and Hermogenes. The Lord grant mercy to the house of Onesimus, for he often refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chains. You see, to some, they looked at Paul in prison and said, well, that's just too much. We have to distance ourselves from him. We can't be associated with somebody. That's a bad reputation. But there were those like Onesimus who stayed with him. Maybe because Onesimus had spent his own time in that jail cell. But you know, it doesn't really matter the why. The text doesn't tell us, remember the prisoners that are in there because they didn't deserve it, but it tells us to remember all of them. Remember those that are in prison. So why would the text tell us this? Why would scriptures make this point? Tonight I want to consider 3 reasons that we need to remember the prisoners. And it comes from the text that we read in Hebrews 13. You see, we need to remember the prisoners because it allows us to empathize. The text tells us as though in prison with them. You see, empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's place, to feel what they're feeling. We talk about the phrase, you don't know somebody until you walk a mile in their shoes. That's to empathize. That's to put yourself in that situation. To realize and to feel that that person, no matter what reason, what they would be going through. Scriptures command us to do that, not just to prisoners, but to everyone. In Romans chapter 12, verses 15 and 16, it says to rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Notice how verse 15 and 16 are linked. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. You know, sometimes we look at somebody who's extremely happy and our first thought is, well, they just don't know any better. They don't know what's wrong. They don't know all the problems. Weep with those who weep. We may want to distance ourselves when we see someone weeping. We don't want to experience those emotions. Same thing might be true of those in prison. We don't want to think of ourselves there. We don't want to share and empathize with them, but rather verse 16 tells us to be of the same mind towards one another, but not be haughty in mind. To think maybe differently. You know, it's easy to make a bad judgment when we only do so from one viewpoint. When we only consider our own situation, we only consider our own viewpoint, it's very easy to rush to a bad judgment. But when we learn to empathize, we learn to see things from other points of view. We learn to see how situations might not be as clear as we initially thought. See, when we're haughty in mind, we think we know everything, right? We're wise in our own estimation. But when we learn to empathize, we learn to see things from another person's point of view. You know, it's easy to sit here and say, well, that person's in prison. Only bad people must have done that. The truth of the matter is sometimes you're not a person that has done something that you regret for the rest of your life and are having to deal with the consequences of it. And you may have been lucky to never find yourself in that situation. You may have been lucky enough never to have dealt with that. But when we consider and empathize, Colossians chapter 4, verse 1, when we read, Masters, grant your slaves justice and fairness, knowing you too have a master in heaven. See, that's the same thing that Paul is saying here to masters, those who are over others, to sit there and say, don't just sit here and think, well, this is my viewpoint and it's right, but to think about those who are under you, your slaves. Make sure you're treating them right and fair, because you too will be in that same situation. You see, empathizing allows us to maybe see another person's point of view, and it also helps us to understand ourselves a little bit better. And maybe to understand when we make mistakes and we fail. Allows us a little sympathy because it allows us to humanize. The passage in Hebrews tells us as those who were ill-treated. You see, there would be people who would be in prisons, especially the prisons of that day, where the treatment that they would receive, it wouldn't matter what they had done. No one deserves that. Unfortunately, we have a mindset, I'm afraid, that almost thinks if something terrible happens to someone who's done something bad, well, it's all right then. I mean, we think of prisons as terrible places where terrible things happen, but sometimes we seem a little too excited about that. Well, that person's going to go to prison and something terrible is going to happen to him there. That shouldn't be our viewpoint. That shouldn't be our thinking. You know, Freud Dostoevsky once said, the degree of a civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. He would have known. He spent time in some of the worst prisons that have ever been in Russia. See, I say that because if we consider the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 25 and verses 33 through 34, we can see the company that it sets us in when we do and when we don't. You see, here the king has come and he says to those in his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom for you, which was from the foundation. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Of course, for those that are hearing the king's words, they can't figure out what he's talking about. We never went to you. You were never in prison. We never dealt with you in any of those situations. But he says in verses 34, 38, and 40, when you did it to the least of these, when you did it to the extent of one of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. See, how we treat other humans is a reflection of how we think about God. John says in John 4:20, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Folks, when we become okay with another human being being treated terribly, then we're losing our perspective that God has given us. You see, God is a loving God. That doesn't mean that God takes away all punishment. No, he doesn't. That doesn't mean that God doesn't allow suffering, because he does. But it also shows that God's love wants to overcome those things. We need to think of those who are ill-treated. Those people who suffer no matter where it is and how it is. James says in James 3, we bless our Lord and Father if we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. It may be difficult to see sometimes, but every person is made in the likeness of God. And we need to think about that when how we treat other people. Circumstances may have made them very ugly to our appearance, but they still bear the resemblance of God. We need to consider that in how we treat others. We need to remember the prisoners because it allows us to humanize. It allows us to realize that they are something that was created in the image of God. If God looked at us when we were at our worst and cast us away, where would we be? God loved us while we were yet sinners. We need to show that love as well. We need to remember those who were ill-treated. We need to remember the prisoners because it allows us to personalize. Here he told us to remember those prisoners since you yourselves are also in the body. Here he was thinking of those who may have been, and maybe even those who would face death like James at the hands of government officials. What he's telling us there is to personalize because we're sort of the same body. It's what we talked about earlier with that idea of empathy, that idea of putting yourself in someone's place and looking at someone not through that was made in the image of God. See, when we personalize, when we consider our relationship, changes our viewpoint. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25 and 26 reads, "So there may be no divisions in the body, since all the members have the same care for. If one is honored, all the members rejoice with it." See, the body that brings us together is not limited by some of the things that we think separate us. Things like distance or nationality or even the walls of a prison. We need to remember the prisoners because there are those that are in prison that are part of the body. Sometimes facing a sentence makes one reconsider life's choices, makes one reconsider the things that they've done, makes one look for a different path, makes one look and understand the need to be saved. We need to be considerate of that. We don't need to just dismiss those who would find themselves locked away. But also we need to consider it from another perspective. You see, not all prisons have walls. I think here that Paul is specifically, the Hebrew writer and Paul have been specifically talking about those people who were in literal prisons. But it's not too far to extend that metaphor and extend that line of thinking. See, there are some people who are prisoners in their own body. They're not able to attend services. They're not able to get out because physically their bodies won't allow them to do so. Do we forget about those people because we don't see them so often? There are some people who are prisoners to bad situations. It might be a cycle of poverty. It might be an abusive relationship. It might be in a difficult set of circumstances that they face. And sometimes it's easier for us just to forget about them, to dismiss them, to not give sympathy, to not give empathy, to not even think of them as other human beings. But because they're in difficult situations, we just dismiss. Maybe it's when we see people in the prison of sin. Well, they're just sinners. They've made a terrible decision. They've done something that's wrong. And it can be very easy for us just to say, well, they made their decision. We don't have to have anything to do with them. But we need to remember those people trapped in sin and try to bring them to an understanding that will help them to escape the snare of the devil, to help them see in a way that is dehumanizing, but in a way that shows love and compassion and concern. Sometimes people are just caught in their own prisons, maybe by their own bad decisions, their own thinking. And maybe what they need the most is to know someone still cares about them, that they're concerned for them, that they feel what they're feeling, that they still look at them as somebody worthwhile, worth caring about, somebody who can be part of the body that they belong in. When they suffer, we suffer with them. You know, there are those people today who are trapped in prison. They may not see it. They may not know it. But Satan has them cornered. He has them behind his bars. He has their fate sealed. We need to remember those people. Remember, because we've been where they've been. We understand the trap. But we had one who was willing to set us free. One who was able to open the door and let us walk away. You see, all of us have been in a prison of sin. Jesus Christ opened the door. The question is, will we walk out? Will we walk away from the life that is confining us, a free life, life that is free indeed? You know, sometimes prisoners have a hard time when they leave prison because they don't know anything different. And they'll do something to get thrown back in. You think, why would somebody want to go back to such a terrible place? You know, some people do that in sin. They come out separated from our Lord. We want to be the people that are doing what he wants us to do. We want to be those people who hear that King say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. That he invites in. But we can only do that if we live like him. That we are caring for those who need it. Well, we end this lesson with a question. Are you in the body? Are you a part of Christ's body along with those members of his church so you will have someone to support you and care for you? Are you still trapped in a cell, a prison of sin? Jesus has opened the door, but you have to make the decision to leave. Way out. But forgiveness can still be found if you turn back to him. Maybe tonight it's time to make that need known. We offer you a chance to do that. If you want to become a Christian or you want us to pray for you as a Christian, maybe there's something that you're struggling with. We care. We want to be there for you. Song of invitation.
Journey along with the warfare without and within. See my strength and my hope nearly gone. I thirst, let me drink of the rock cleft for me. 'Tis the water of life. In my weakness I turn to the fount, from the rock that was smitten for me. And I drink and I joyfully count all my trials a blessing to be. I thirst, let me drink of the life-giving stream, let me drink. 'Tis the rock cleft for me of life. O thou God of compassion, I pray, let me ever abide in thy sight. Let me drink of the fount day by day, till I join thee in mansions of light. I thirst, let me drink of the life-giving stream, let me drink. 'Tis the rock cleft for me, 'tis the water of life. Remain standing. Library classroom, and if you'll go that way at this time, someone will be there to assist you. Thank you again, Barry, for another great lesson today. We appreciate you. Let's all leave here encouraged today and remember to serve the Lord. And Brother Rosenbaum will have our closing prayer. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. And He will lift you up. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. And He died for us. And He died for us. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound